We're glad to see everybody this morning. Glad that you're here. Pick up an announcement sheet. Kaysen, I was just talking to Pat. Kaysen is getting some good reports. She's still healing. It'll take a little while, but she's doing good. Looks like now she won't have to have shoulder surgery, at least right now. We're thankful for that. That's it. Remember Miss Minnie and her family and passing of her brother Sam, and also Miss Loretta and passing of her brother-in-law James. Anything else? Anybody else? Anything else? We've got one side of the door separating the foyer from the auditorium. We've got one just pulled out. Both of them are there. We just pulled one out for show. They'll stain it later, but if you'd like to see how it looks, that's how it's going to look. So anyway, Acts 25 is where we are, verse 9. The end of the book of Acts is really a story that teaches us about the providence of God, a story that teaches us how Paul's life came to an end. I was thinking about this the other day. It's been several years ago now. It's probably been 15 years ago. I preached a series of lessons through the book of Acts. Now I do series through a book differently depending on the book. And I didn't want it to drag out long, but I tried to get as many things in it as possible. And I was thinking, I did not look it up, but I was thinking, I remember as I was preaching through this series on the book of Acts that I got to about the 21st chapter of the book of Acts. And it was like, in other words, it's just a story. It's a continuous story. It's important. And I'm not trying to say it's not important, but from a standpoint of preaching material, really, you could lump it into a couple of lessons instead of 15, 20, 30, like we usually do as preachers. But it's a story of Paul getting to Rome. And notice that Paul, one of the things that he's going to do is he's appealing to Caesar. Paul has been arrested. He has been accused of insurrection, and in the accusations that the folks have made, they want Paul gone. Now, Paul, if you think about it, did not serve as a physical threat to anybody, but Paul definitely served as a spiritual threat to the Jews. Paul was preaching Jesus Christ. Paul was preaching the truth. And yes, much of the gospel, if you will, much of the New Testament is just like the Old Testament. There are differences. We don't sacrifices, holy days. We don't keep those things. We don't have a priesthood. We do have a priesthood in the New Testament, but different than the Aaronic priesthood of the Old Testament. Of course, baptism for the remission of sins. The fact that you did not have to be of the physical lineage of Abraham, but you, as children of God, Book of Romans, we are, if you will, Abraham's children by virtue of faith and obedience to the will of God. Paul was preaching these things. And because of that, there was a great uproar against Paul and against his preaching and teaching. And Paul was then, as we said, accused of insurrection as he was, and as he's been captured and brought before the procurators, brought before Felix as we ended last week. But now he's being brought before Festus. Festus was a procurator from about AD 60 to AD 62. And so that gives you the time frame of where we are. Beginning in verse 9 of the 25th chapter, it says, Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things? They're wanting a change of venue. Let's go to Jerusalem. There's several possibilities as far as why Festus wanted this. Maybe he wanted to change a venue because he felt like he could have more time, and maybe some of this uproar would die down. Maybe it was due to the fact that he wanted to see Paul from the standpoint of in more neutral territory, or maybe it was the fact he just needed to get home. I don't know. I mean, there's all sorts of speculations, assumptions, and you can make those. We don't really know. He just wants a change of venue. But Paul, in beginning in verse 10, gives an answer. He said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I've done no wrong, as you very well know, for I'm an offender, for if I am an offender or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there's nothing in these things to which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar. Now, there's two or three things that are interesting in these verses. Notice that Paul is willing to be judged. And in verse 10, Paul's willing to be judged immediately. You know, we talk about fair and speedy trials today, and yet reality is from the time that the charge is brought to a trial, you're talking sometimes years, definitely months, but sometimes years before it occurs. Paul says, let's get this thing on. Let's get it on. Let's get it over with. Let's get it finished. I'm willing to stand. And he says, look, he says, you very well know. And the idea here is you have advanced knowledge. In other words, you know I didn't do anything wrong. You know that I am not guilty of the charges that are brought to me. And notice that he says in verse 11, he says, if I am an offender, and if I've committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. Kind of interesting. You can look at this however how you want to, but it's almost as if Paul was endorsing capital punishment. Now, he didn't go out with the sign that says, I'm all for capital punishment. But he said, if I am deserving of death, if what I have done, if the charges are true, the charges are right, and I'm supposed to die, okay. He's willing to give in to the government. He's willing to give in to the punishment that was to be prescribed. He says, I don't object, but he says, if there's nothing to these things, if there's nothing to these charges, I'm going to appeal to Caesar's. Now, Caesar was Nero at this time. There were many different Caesars. Caesars were just the rulers, and so there were different ones, but this was Nero. Nero was not a nice guy. He served as Caesar from 54 to 68 AD, so in that time frame. Nero was mean. He was mean to the Christians. He ruled with a very heavy hand. But Paul says, look, I want to go to Caesar. Now, this was Paul's right. Paul has already, in the book as we have studied, besides the knowledge that we have of Scripture itself, Paul was a Roman citizen. Paul had every right to appeal to Caesar. Ultimately, though, making this, if you will, a capital offense and a capital punishment. But Paul says, let's appeal this to Caesar. Let's go, as we would say today, let's go to the Supreme Court. Let's go to the highest court of the land. His appeal, though, would stop everything with regards to Festus and his decision of Paul. Now, could it be that Paul figured out that Festus was going to do everything in his power to keep peace among the people? Because that's what, remember we talked about a procurator, as we called Festus, is just a governor of the area, that he kind of made sure that the day-to-day workings of the area went smoothly. He made sure that if there were any judicial decisions such as this, not in the capital offense. He did not have ability to make capital offenses, but if any sort of daily judgment, he's in charge of that. And his big thing, as far as Rome was concerned, was to send back the tax money. to make sure the tax money was collected and that it was sent back to Rome. And as long as he could keep peace, Rome was happy, and Rome stayed out of it. But when you appeal to the highest court of the land, when you appeal to Caesar based upon his Roman citizenship, which he had every right to do, it stops everything else. And so he moves on. Festus, verse 12, when he conferred with the council, answered, "You've appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you shall go." And maybe old Festus was was relieved. Okay, I've got to keep peace, and I got to make the Jewish folks happy, but Paul hasn't done anything worthy of what they're saying. And so what do I do? Oh, you want to go to Caesar? Gladly. Go on. And so verse 13, after some days, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus. King Agrippa. This was Agrippa II. Notice that it says King Agrippa and Bernice, brother and sister, married, incestuous relationship. They were not nice. They were not kind at all. So after some days, King Agrippa, Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus. And when they had been there many days, Festus laid, bless you, Paul's case before the king, saying, "There's a certain man left a prisoner by Felix, about whom the chief priests and the elders of the kings informed me when I was in Jerusalem, asking," and this is the idea, get the flow, because here's the charge that they make against the Jews. The Jews were asking, they kept asking. It wasn't a one-time ask. They kept asking for a judgment against him. To them I answered, it is not the custom. It's not the legal procedure. This is not the way we do this. It is not the custom of the Romans to deliver any man to destruction before the accused meets the accuser face to face and has the opportunity to answer for himself concerning the charge against him. So you got to have a witness. You got the individual that's making the charge has to make the charge face to face, open courtroom. Therefore, when they had come together without any delay the next day, I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought in. When the accuser stood up, they brought no accusation against him, such things as I supposed. The idea is, I supposed. He says, this is sort of what I thought. This is what I felt. But, he said, had some questions about him, about their own religion. Does anybody have a different version that says anything other than religion? The old King James says something different. It says superstition. But it's religion is probably more correct. And about a certain Jesus. Now, that's an interesting accusation. Notice what it says. And about a certain Jesus. Not about the Jesus, but about a certain, a particular Jesus. Why would they make that accusation? Well, remember, there were folks claiming to be the Messiah. There were folks claiming to be Jesus. Many folks, as a matter of fact. But there was one, as they say, that was charging Paul, that he was talking about, a certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. Boy, isn't that a dilemma for folks that don't believe in the resurrection? Now, we sit so far away from the resurrection, time-wise, that we sit back and we look and we say, man, I can see it easily. But think about those that were in the midst of this. Think about, as the old saying goes, you've heard this old saying, you can't see the forest for the trees, right? Because sometimes you're in the middle of the forest. When Suzanne and I were on vacation, we went through Chattahoochee Forest. And you have to go there, at least the way we went in to Helen, Georgia, and the way we came out of Helen, Georgia, and we went differently. But both ways you had to go through the Chattahoochee Forest. It was beautiful. Don't get me wrong, it was beautiful. But until you found a break in the trees, until you found an area maybe where you could park and look, all you could see was trees on all sides of the road. And you can't necessarily see the forest, if you will, because you just have trees right there around you. Well, these folks were having a hard time. More so than, say, probably those of us today, especially that live in this area of the world. Why? Well, we believe in the resurrection of Christ. It is, in many ways, the foundation of Christianity. It is upon which we base our faith. But the folks of that day, they denied it. There were many of them that denied the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Because if you prove or if you believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, what then do you have to follow? Jesus had to be somebody special. More specifically, he had to be the Christ. And so those that were opposed to Paul, that was an accusation that he's preaching about a Christ raised from the dead. And because I was uncertain of some questions, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there be judged concerning these matters. But when Paul appealed to be reserved for the decision of Augustus Caesar, I commanded him to be kept till I could send him to Caesar. It's the evidence, if you will, versus the right thing to do. He doesn't really talk about the evidence. Now he talks about the charge, but he talks about really saying this was the right thing to do. He appealed to Caesar, so that's where we brought him. Anything else? Well, look what Agrippa says to Festus beginning in verse 22. I also would like to hear the man myself. The word hear is interesting. It's the idea of hearing thoroughly. In other words, I don't want to just hear about it. I don't want to just hear the highlights. I don't want to just hear one side. I want to hear this matter, and I want to hear more about it. I want to hear more of the case. I want to hear more of the evidence. And so, in many ways, you say, well, Agrippa's not bad. At least he wanted to hear it. So, he says, tomorrow you shall hear him. So the next day, when Agrippa and Bernice had come with great pomp and entered the auditorium with commanders. Now, the commanders were folks that were over 1,000 soldiers. The commanders came, and prominent men of the city, these were the leading dignitaries. At Festus' command, Paul was brought in, and Festus said, King Agrippa, and all men who are here present with us, you see this man about whom the whole assembly of the Jews petitioned me or appealed to me, both at Jerusalem and here, crying out that he was not fit to live any longer. But when I found that he had committed nothing deserving of death. So here's the difference. Charge for the Jews was, let's kill him. Notice what Festus says. He says, I couldn't find anything deserving of death. And that he himself had appealed to Caesar. I decided to send him. Notice what he said. I decided to send him. That truly is true, but it wasn't really or shouldn't have been left up to him to decide. Once Paul appealed to Caesar, that ended. He had to go to Caesar. But notice he almost makes it like, well, I decided. Bigwigs sometimes like to think that they're the ones in charge, right? And so I decided. Then verse 26, I have nothing certain to write to my Lord concerning him. Therefore, I've brought him out before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the examination has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable. The word unreasonable is the idea of irrational. It seems to me irrational to send a prisoner and not specify the charges against him. Well, that's true. That's true. How ridiculous would it have been if Festus had just sent Paul to Caesar, to Nero, and basically said, here he is, have at him, good luck, and really start over. He says, I needed some charges, but I didn't have any. But he appealed to Caesar. And so here we are. Anything else? Well, then Agrippa, this is chapter 26 now, Agrippa said to Paul, you are permitted to speak for yourself. So here's an invitation from Agrippa. Here, we're going to let you speak. Now, Paul had been promised that this would happen. You go back to the 9th chapter, you see that. And so here's an invitation to speak to the people. Paul stretched out his hand and answered for himself. Remember, we talked about an apologia, which is basically an oral defense. I talked about an apologia a couple of weeks ago. Well, Paul, he stretched out his hand, he gestured as if maybe he was fixing to speak or maybe to silence the crowd. And he begins by his apologia or his answer by this, verse 2. I think myself happy, King Agrippa. You say, happy? Well, he's happy for the opportunity. Getting the chance. He's getting the chance to defend. Have you ever been charged with something and never been able to defend yourself? It happens to preachers and elders meetings, not these elders, but it happens in elders meetings. It's happened to me several times in elders meetings. You don't get a charge, you're charged and you're guilty before you ever get to say anything. And Paul says, I'm happy I get this opportunity, because today I shall answer for myself before you concerning all the things of which I am accused by the Jews. Now, when you look at that word accused, it looks as if it's something that they charged him with in the past. The accusation is ongoing, the verb tense in the Greek. This is a continual thing. It's not, they charged me, it's over, it's done. They're still charging me with this. And so Paul says, I want to answer this, considering the accusations that have been made against me, especially because you're an expert. Now, here's a compliment. He's trying to get in a little good with him. He says, you're an expert. It's one who knows the law, practices the law. You're an expert in all the customs and questions which have to do with the Jews. How much he knew with regards to Jewish practice, we don't know. Paul evidently thought he knew a lot. I don't think Paul is just blowing smoke to be blowing smoke. Paul is saying, you know a lot about the Jewish ways. You know a lot about the Jewish customs. You're one that you understand. You're an expert. You have knowledge in these fields. Therefore, I beg you to hear me patiently. Just wait to hear what I've got to hear. I've got to say. And so he begins. Anything else? He does begin. The story just keeps flowing. Excuse me. My manner of life from my youth. This is Paul. He talks about how he spent his life. My manner from my youth, which was spent from the beginning among my own nation at Jerusalem. All the Jews know. They know me from the first, if they are willing to testify, that according to the strictest sect of our religion, I lived a Pharisee. Paul is going to give us some insights that we know, because we've studied this before. But Paul, the first thing he says is, I want you to know I'm a Pharisee. I'm of that strict band of Jews. I'm a Pharisee from the Jewish nation. I'm a Jew by all background. And now I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made by God our fathers. In other words, I was a Jew. I was raised a Jew, born a Jew, raised a Jew, lived a Jewish life, lived like a Pharisee, because that is of the group, if you will, that I believed. Now, remember, the Pharisees were you had several different groups. You had Essenes, you had Zealots, but the two major groups of the Jews were the Sadducees and Pharisees. And the Sadducees were a whole lot smaller than the Pharisees. So I'm of the biggest group, if you will. I'm of the Pharisees, and I'm ready to be judged. He said, I stand and am judged of the promise that was made by God, the hope. That hope is found in the fact that what had his charge been just a few verses earlier that we studied? The resurrection of Christ. He preached the resurrection of Christ. He preached the hope of God. He preached that the law was not the fulfillment thereof. No one was bound by anymore the old law. He preached that been liberated from that old law, set free from that old law. And as being set free, we were individuals that were then bound by the law of Christ. That's what he had been preaching. And but think about, if you're listening to this and you're listening for key words, he says, I'm going to be judged on the hope. That's a strong word that's positive. Of the hope of the promise. This was a promise made by God. Go back through the Old Testament. Find all the prophecies with regards to Jesus. Find all the prophecies with regards to the hope of God. Already, Paul has alienated the Jews. He has buttered up, if you will, he has buttered up the king. And in doing so, he is expressly expressed. Yes, that's the way I wanted to say it. Expressly expressed the hope that God gives to every child of God. And he says, now I stand and am judged to the hope of the promise made by God our fathers. To this promise, our 12 tribes, all of Israel, 12 tribes, no more, there weren't any more, the entire Israel. To this promise, our 12 tribes, earnestly serving God night and day, hope to attain. Earnestly serving. It's the idea of unceasing zeal. That zeal did not stop. That zeal for them, it was a consuming passion. What? To serve God night and day. Because of the hope that they wished to attain. And for this hope's sake, King Agrippa, I'm accused by the Jews. Why should it be thought incredible by you? Now, this is interesting. You can be used singularly. I can't talk this morning. It can be used from a single standpoint, or it can be used from a plural standpoint. This you, as he refers back, as he calls him the king, King Agrippa, he says, why should it be thought incredible by you? He's not just talking about King Agrippa. He is all of a sudden addressing everybody. Paul's, if you will, little talk here is to Agrippa, but it is also to everybody. And so when he addresses to you, he says, why should it be thought incredible by you that God raises the dead? You see, Paul is now turning to the audience and saying, why don't you believe this? Why can't you believe this? Why won't you believe this? And so it's a time of introspection that these people ought to be feeling. That all of a sudden, maybe we should be thinking about this. I think I shared with you the story of a young girl. She's a mama now, and well, she's got 2 or 3 girls. Her husband is actually an elder at a church in Middle Tennessee now, where they go to church. And I know one of her girls is in college. 2 of them might be. But anyway, she was raised in denomination. And before I ever got to the congregation, where I was preaching at the time, she had been converted. She'd married a young boy who was a member of the church, very strong member of the church, very faithful member of the church, and she had married him. And before they got married, they had studied. He had studied with her, and he converted her. And so fast forward several years, and I'm sitting talking with her one day, and she's talking about her family who's still in denominationalism. And she makes a point. She says, Brother Paul, I don't understand why they don't see and can't see and won't see what I see now. And so we discussed that for quite a while. But that was her plea. I wish they could. I wish they would. Why don't people see it the way we see it? Well, there's a lot of factors. Some just don't want to see it. Some want to see what they want to see because of what they have been told, because of what they've always heard. I don't think I've ever shared with you this story of a man I know of that he told a story once in a man's Bible study that I was sitting in at the time. And he said, I'm sitting there studying with the Bible with this man that does not believe, he believes in a truth, but not the truth. And he said, we're sitting there studying. He said, we've just got our Bibles open. That's all we've got. We've got our Bibles open and we're studying. And he says, it's about midnight. And said, he just starts crying. And he said, I asked him, are you all right? Yeah. Well, what's the problem? He said, it has been here all along. I have read this book through and through. It has been here all along, and I just haven't seen it till now. Well, kind of reminds you of the Ethiopian eunuch in a lot of ways. And it wasn't too long before, in that conversation, that man said, take me now and baptize me for the remission of my sins. Well, why don't folks see it like that? Well, there's a lot of different reasons. Mom and Daddy taught them wrongly. They were led astray. They don't want to hear it. They can't fit it all together. It doesn't fit the narrative that they like. It goes against family, and thus I shared with you a story back some time ago about a man that came to church a little bit. His son was a deacon in the church, later on an elder in the church. His wife was a very faithful member of the church as well. And he would come occasionally. He'd come Friends and Family Day, and he'd come Easter, and he'd come Christmas, and things like that. But that's pretty much the extent of it. And he was a very good man. I mean, I talked to him a lot out in public, just a really great guy. And his wife died. His wife got sick, and she suffered for quite a while. And she came to church 2 or 3 times in her last few months, but couldn't get out and couldn't come to church. But when she'd come, he would come, and he was a man's man. Now, I don't mean he was a bully or anything. He's just a man's man. And yet, when he came with her those last few months, he always carried her purse. It was heartwarming to see. It really was. And she passed away. And about 2 weeks later, his son calls me up, and Paul, it's about 4:30 in the afternoon. Yeah, you at the church building? Yeah. Can you stay there? Absolutely. What do you need? Daddy wants to be baptized. Bring him on. Bring him on. And so they did, and so he was. And I sat there and talked with him for a few minutes because, like I say, we talked a lot, different times. And I asked him, I said, tell me why and tell me what's going on. And he said, I've come to the realization my wife was right and my mama was wrong. And so I want to be baptized for the remission of my sins so I can spend eternity with my wife. So his son, I helped, but his son baptized him not long right after that. If people open up their hearts and open up their eyes and open up their lives and just see, it's not a matter of I'm right and you're wrong. I may disagree with you, but it's not a matter of I'm right and you're wrong. It's a matter of let's see what this says. Let's see what the righteousness of God reveals about what is righteous. And let's practice it. Anything else before we go on with Paul's talk? All right, well, verse 9. Indeed, I myself thought I must do many things contrary to the name of Jesus Christ. Now there's the problem, right? It's the same problem that we're seeing on Wednesday nights in the book of Judges. I thought. Paul says it was my opinion that I should be killing Christians, that I should be doing everything. And notice what he says. He makes this more of a moral compulsion than anything else, that I should be doing many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. He saw all of the teachings of Jesus as one complete, entire package. He didn't see, well, let's take this, and then let's take this over here, and then let's take this over here. No, he saw it as one complete package. He said, I thought I should do everything contrary to Jesus. And he said, verse 10, this I also did in Jerusalem, and many of the saints I shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priest. And when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. He said, I did what I could. I put some to death, I put some in prison. He said, I had the authority of the chief priest. Remember, the chief priest would have been what? A Jew, right? And so the chief priest says, yeah, let's get rid of Paul. So Paul, or excuse me, of Christians, excuse me. And so Paul said, as a Jew, I did these things. Notice the basis for Paul's actions. His conscience. We spent time a couple of weeks ago talking about Paul's conscience and our conscience and how that conscience is taught, and conscience can be good up to a point, but it cannot be the final say. It cannot be the final authority. But Paul was using it as his final authority. He said, I shut up Christians in prison. I had received authority. And he says, when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. Casting votes in that time was a little different than casting votes today. We go up, and of course, I've been voting for quite a while now, and it has changed through the years. And it's not one time you put a little X, and then of course we moved up to machines, and we've had all different kinds of machines that have been selected to be used in casting votes. When you casted a vote in Paul's day, you would go up and there would either be a white stone or a black stone. White stone was innocent, black stone was guilty. And so when Paul says that he cast, if you will, he says, I cast my vote, he would take that black stone out, and that would be his pick for his vote for putting these Christians to death. And he said in verse 11, and I punished them. It's continual. It's not part-time. I continued to punish them often in every synagogue and compelled them to blaspheme. Now think about what he says. I punished them in the synagogue. Place that should have been considered holy. He said, I punished them in every synagogue. I made them, I compelled them. It's the idea of I kept compelling them. I kept pushing them. I kept striving to make them blaspheme. The word blaspheme just means to speak against, to speak evil of, to speak against. And being exceedingly enraged against them. I persecuted them, even to foreign cities. Do you get a sense of Paul's makeup here? Paul had a zeal. It's interesting because Paul talk about certain ones in Romans, the 10th chapter. If you go to Romans chapter 10, Paul talks about, he says, for I bear them record, they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. Verse 4. That's really where Paul was. He didn't know it. He thought what he was doing was right. But he said, I was enraged. I mean, this ate me up. This was my passion. This was my life. This is what I got up in the morning to do and what I went to bed at night thinking about. How can I persecute Christians? What can I do to Christians? And so he said, it ate him up. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. I hadn't really thought about it. But it's a great question, great point, because we're about, if it, the best we can figure out, Paul was baptized somewhere around 43, 45 AD. And so if we're talking 60 AD, we're talking 20 years, give or take. So that's a good point. That's an excellent point. I wonder how many of them had forgotten or knew. So that's good. Worthy of thought. How far and wide all that news had spread. Um, Paul had worked on it because if you think about it, we're finished with his 3 missionary journeys. So the news, but how many in this audience? That's a good question. Good point. Eh, Yeah, 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 yeah. It's still a phenomenon that a lot of people don't understand. We probably don't talk, well, I'll say not probably, we don't really talk about it enough in the church. Very true. All good. And it keeps changing. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's there's a lot that has to be called in. I think of my mother. My mother. I can see. I can talk about my family. I can't talk about your family unless you give me okay. I can talk about my family. My mother was raised as a member of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. My mama was the organ and piano player for the Cumberland Presbyterian Church in Humboldt, Tennessee. My papa was considered a deacon in the Cumberland Presbyterian Church in Humboldt, Tennessee. My father was raised by his mother mostly. My grandfather at some point in time And I really don't know when, but at some point in time, my grandfather decided he liked the next door neighbor's wife better than he liked my grandmother. So he left her for the next door neighbor. And whole different story. But mother, as I tell my parents' story, when mom and dad got married, that was one of the big things she had to kick against, because her own father, my papa, her dad, she was talking to him one day, I think after they had gotten married, and Papa said, "You need to be in church with your husband." And so she started going to church with Dad, and they did. And it took her 6 years to admit that she needed to obey the gospel. But I'll take that back. Wait a minute. It took her 8 years. It took her 8 years, because they were married 6, and then Carol came along, and Carol was 2 when Mother obeyed the gospel. So it took her 8 years to obey the gospel. But when she did, Miss Suzanne let you out early. Does she not know how to count how many bells we have? Oh, I was going to blame Miss Suzanne. So, Mother was then converted, and Dad eventually was an elder in the church. But that was, Mother talked about how difficult that was to make that decision. And so, yeah, family, huge, and who you're going to have to reject. Because basically then what she had to do in doing that was reject all of her. She had 5 siblings. Reject them and their teaching. Now, that's not to say that we didn't get along. We all did. We all spent all holidays and vacations and all together. But religiously, it's kind of interesting, because we got up on Sunday mornings when we were all together, and we all went separate places. I have an aunt and uncle, went to the Baptist church, had one that stayed at home, one that we went to the Church of Christ. We all went different places. Another one that went to the Cumberland Presbyterian Church with my grandparents. And so, what you got to kick against sometimes. Difficult. Good point. Anything else? Well, the interesting thing is, now we have the third time, the last time in the book of Acts, that Paul's conversion story is told. It is told by Paul. It is told from the standpoint of, we learn a couple more things that we haven't learned before. We're reminded of a couple of things, but it's told from the standpoint of court proceedings. I'm just going to end there. We'll just start there in verse 12, if you don't mind, next week, and Lord willing, and look there at that and talk about what Paul said with regards to his conversion. And that's why you got to remember, when we look at the book of Acts, we see Paul's conversion story told more than once. You don't say the Ethiopian eunuch story told but once, Acts 8. But you see Paul's story told 3 times. And why is it so different? Well, it's told from different vantage points and told from a standpoint of different theme or thesis point that was trying to be made. And that's why it's there, but it's so different. Anything else? All right, well, let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful to you for this day, for the many blessings of it. Thankful that you love us and that you watch over us. Thankful for your care. Thankful for your love. And thankful for the way that you provide for us. We're thankful for the story of Paul and what it means to us. For really, as we break it down, we see so many things and so many issues, so many lessons that can be learned. But the ultimate issue and the ultimate theme that can be learned is that you took care of him. That you did get him just as you had promised, that you did get him to Rome, just as you had said that you would, and that you watched over him and took care of him as you will us. We ask now that you be with us as we go throughout our period of worship, that we'll worship you in spirit and truth. Watch over us, bless us, and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Have a great week. Thank y'all.